Welcome to BioCircular Loop, the podcast about success stories, innovation, and the newest developments in the European bioeconomy. Every episode, you will hear from the people that are driving the industrial biorevolution towards a future filled with circular innovation and renewable resources. Stay informed, get inspired. I'm Melina Gerdts, and I'm hosting this podcast to keep you in the BioCircular Loop. Welcome back to another episode of the BioCircular Loop podcast. Today we're going to touch upon a topic that represents a challenge for pretty much every company that is bringing a bio-based innovation to market: scaling the production and operations from lab to industrial scale. The head of business operations from the biobased Europe pilot plant in Belgium will guide us through understanding the key challenges and why so many biotech startups fail, what a business model looks like that supports companies in this area, and an overview of scaling infrastructure for bio-based innovation in Europe over the past years. So it's probably no news to most of you listening to this podcast that 90% of startups fail in the first 3 years. This is generally tied to challenges related to funding, but also product market fit. In the biotechnology sector, the so-called Valley of Death, which refers to the challenging period between a promising discovery and its commercialization due to a lack of funding and the high risks involved in developing the product at an industrial scale, represents the greatest challenge. The EFB Bioeconomy Journal estimates this gap that only 1 in 5,000 to 10,000 innovations survive the long journey from initial findings to market. Now, there are a few reasons for this, and they are mainly tied to the securing of funding, biomass availability, challenges related to new market creation, but most importantly, being able to access infrastructure that allows for the scaling operations from lab to an industrial scale. Building demo plants or industrial scale plants requires large investment sums and is very time-consuming, representing a high-risk investment. This is why most biotech startups and companies with early-stage innovations decide to outsource the production in the beginning to so-called CDMOs, which stands for Contract Development and Manufacturing Organizations, which are essentially contract manufacturers. And in this way, biotech firms can avoid the significant capital and operational costs associated with building and maintaining their own manufacturing lines. CDMOs offer a range of services and scaling infrastructure depending on their industry focus and expertise. So, today you're going to learn all about this topic and how biotech startups can best avoid failure. I'm very excited to host Hendrik Waegeman, the head of operations at the biobased Europe pilot plant, one of the world's largest pilot and demonstration facilities for industrial biotechnology. Hendrik has a background in biochemical engineering and holds a PhD in applied biological sciences chemical engineering from Ghent University. He's been involved in various projects focused on precision fermentation. He founded a biotech company in 2013 and since 2019 is head of business operations and responsible for the operational management of the biobased Europe pilot plant. Welcome, Hendrik, and thank you for joining today.
Hi, Melina. Glad to be on your podcast today.
So where am I catching you, Hendrik? Where are you located right now?
I'm located in the facility. So our facility is in Ghent, in Belgium. And for the people who can also view basically where I'm just sitting in front of one of our process halls, our fermentation hall. And it's basically a bit the core of the facility, where it all starts, where we have the fermentation processes running from small to larger scale.
Yeah, indeed. I can see the plant right behind you. So on LinkedIn, then the listeners will be able to actually see this. So Hendrik, tell me, what is the biobased Europe pilot plant?
Yeah, so the biobased Europe pilot plant is basically an open access shared pilot facility. And what it means is that the infrastructure and the operations is basically shared amongst a lot of users. And by doing so, basically drastically reducing the need for CapEx investment, but also for running the facility, because very often it's basically the cost of running that facility that is underestimated. So what we basically do is we help companies to bring their innovations from lab to market. So our slogan is turning grams into tons. So basically helping companies when they're able, and I often say in the best case scenario, when they're able to produce a few grams of product, we will translate that process into something that allows production of tons of materials. And we also demonstrate that production here at the Biobased Europe pilot plant by actually also producing those tons of material.
Okay, and when was this founded and by who? Is this a private company or is it, let's say, owned also by the state?
So the Biobased Europe pilot plant was founded in 2008, end of 2008, as you might remember, quite challenging times because we had, of course, the financial crisis back then. It was founded by our current CEO, Wim Soetaert, together with some public stakeholders, and it now operates as a non-profit organization. That does not mean that we don't want to make profit. We absolutely intend to make profit, but the profit is not distributed amongst shareholders. No, it's reinvested into growth.
So private and with the purpose in that sense to really offer the infrastructure for scaling for the sector.
Yeah, I think what's nice is I joined in 2012. So basically, the first years where we were getting permits and setting everything up, I was not involved. So I joined basically when the action started, which was pretty nice. But you have to know that initially we started off with a very limited budget because you mentioned also in the intro, we're now one of the largest pilot and demonstration facilities worldwide. But initially, we started off with a very limited budget, 13 million euro, 1 3, and the facility. We got the facility available by North Sea Port, the port of Ghent, basically, because that port merged a couple of years ago with the ports of Vlissingen and Terneuzen. But North Sea Port gave this building to us, which is actually an old fire station. So we turned an old fire station into a pilot facility, initially with 13 million, but as you can imagine, with 13 million, you don't get very far.
Sure.
So after a couple of years, we were able to get additional funding, and now 2025 we've invested more than 80 million in total, 80. So we've grown quite significantly since those early years. But I think what was really nice for us is that we've been able, and it was not intended, but afterwards looking back at it, what was very nice is that we did it in steps. Because by doing so, we did it in a very smart manner. If we would have to invest 80 million euro from the start, we would probably not invested it that wisely as how we've done it today.
Okay, so it wasn't that you, in that sense, acquired a building or already something where you had a refinery or a biorefinery, but you really started from scratch. So you just had, let's say, this brownfield site, the old building, and then you really invested from the ground up. You built this, yeah.
Yeah. So the fire station actually initially had an own swimming pool, had an own sports hall, had a garage where the trucks
Hmm.
could be stationed. And so basically, also the people who can see the videos online, the fermentation hall that you see just behind me used to be the former swimming pool.
Really? Ah.
Yeah, and the swimming pool was used for diving exercises for the firemen.
And now you have all of this yeah, scaling technology in the pool, basically.
Well, it's a nice quote actually, and I steal it from our CEO. So we used to have one swimming pool for people, and now we have many swimming pools for microorganisms.
That's very good. So, Hendrik, can you maybe give us your insights into why so many biotech startups are failing at scaling?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of reasons, and looking at indeed a bit from my perspective as from a scale-up facility. I think one of the things is obviously the high capex and opex. You also mentioned already in introduction. Once you go to pilot and demo scale, the cost for the infrastructure really become very high. And also the cost for operating that facility, which is always underestimated, also are very, very high. And the reason for that is that we're working with biotechnology. We're using microorganisms. They grow 24/7. So that means that you also need people to follow up on that. Also in the downstream, you basically you don't want to stop a process in between. You also want to run it continuously. So you need people in night, in weekend, to follow up those processes. So the operational costs become quite significant if you want to pull this off. And Before we existed, basically large corporates and also wealthy startups who raised a lot of capital typically built their own pilot facilities. But to be honest, it's a burden. Running your own pilot facility is a burden. I'm not saying for the large corporates who it's still a burden, but I mean they can afford it because it can basically send a lot of innovations into that facility. But when you're a startup and when you only have a couple of product lines that you want to scale up, that means that it's a big effort to run that facility. And basically, one of the quotes that I also like a lot is from a good friend of mine, Alex Batiste. Alex Batiste, steel is a bad deal. Alex used to work for Genematica, Bolt Threads, Cargill, has run several pilot facilities in his life. And he knows that basically it distracts you. You want to bring your innovation to market, but because you have to put so much effort in running that facility and the day to day issues and problems that you have with it, like pumps breaking down, sterility issues, all of that. I mean, it's not worth it. That having said, it's not because you now have these open access pilot and demo facilities where you can go to that it's for free, that it's super cheap. I mean, it's still expensive, but it's significantly cheaper than it used to be when you build up your own pilot and demo lines. And for startups that have only raised a couple of millions of euros, it's really an opportunity to produce that first market ready material where, I mean, in the past that was not possible. I mean, if you have to,
Mm.
they didn't have the capital to build up a pilot plant, so it basically killed the innovation.
So
So that's a
sorry, just so it essentially allows the startup to, focus the available resources just on the research, development, and then commercialization, right? And they don't have the headache of sort of dealing with the day to day. That's what you
yeah.
essentially take over. Okay. Mm-hmm.
That's one reason. I think a bit linked to it is also scale up is really teamwork. You really need a lot of multidisciplinary expertise. So basically, you need people who are very creative in developing new bioprocesses and optimizing. It's a really PhD-like profiles, but you also need people who can translate a process from a lab into something that would work at real production scale, who can also downscale basically conditions from production scale to lab or small pilot scale, so really production engineers or process engineers. And then on top of that, you also need people with different technology backgrounds. So people who are strong in fermentation, maybe yeast fermentation, maybe E. coli. I mean, there's also difference, fungal fermentation. On DSP, people with expertise in filtration, chromatography, drying techniques. So it's a lot of different expertises that you need when you're a startup and you want to have that all of that in your company. That can be quite a challenge as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's essentially really like a team question as well. So and then that everyone ends up speaking the same language, right? So from all these different departments and expertises.
Mm.
And so this is something that you are offering, right? Can you give us or can you walk us through, what exactly you are doing to support startups or I guess even established companies in scaling from lab to market?
To put it in one sentence a bit, is that we do everything with a high level of detail. I mean, that's also what differentiates us from others. How we work is that we will typically run some tech transfer runs from the customer. So basically, we will first ask their technology transfer package, basically asking the details of their process. With some Q&A, we will translate that into what we call a process run design. So basically putting on paper how we would execute it, because first of all, the devil is in the details. So it's very important to understand the same things. But secondly, it's also not often not possible to, let's say, in 100% way, do the same thing at pilot scale. So you might need to adjust some things, and it's important also to do that translation. So then together with the customer, we will discuss on that approach. We agree on that approach and we will run it. And then once it's successful, we basically go step by step. So in our case, we can do tech transfer at 30 liter or 150 liter stainless steel vessels typically because we like to mimic the conditions that we also have at larger scale. And then we'll go step by step to 1500, 15 cube, 75 cube. A bit depending on the complexity of the process, we will decide how fast that will go. It depends on the fermentation process itself, how complex is it, but also on the downstream. And it's often the downstream that it's, yeah, basically determining the timelines. Because how solid is the downstream process protocol that you have received from the customer? Does it require some adaptations or not? Do we still have to investigate stuff? Is it perfect? We have technology transfer packages where we say, okay, nothing to add, we can just implement as such. And then it's just a validation question. So every project is a bit different. And I think with the expertise that we have, we try to come up with a proposal that really matches the needs of the company, specifically tailor made. But yeah, it's always an estimation basically on what is necessary.
Can you give us a bit more of a concrete example, since it's a bit abstract that we're just talking about scaling bio-based innovation, but there are a few different applications, right? Or I mean, we have food tech application, ag tech, we have the material, the chemical, and so many more. Could you give us an idea? What is the range or the verticals that you are focusing on here?
Yeah, so we're product agnostic. So the only prerequisites that we have is that it needs to be a bio-based feedstock, or we have to apply industrial biotech. And I say or, because, for example, we've also worked on fossil-derived feedstocks that are waste streams, like waste gases from the ArcelorMittal steel manufacturing facility. So that's one feedstock we use. Or plastics, for example, waste plastics that we convert with microbes into new plastics. So I say on purpose or, but basically, most of the processes that we do involves the use of microorganisms in one way or the other, or its derived enzymes. So on the verticals, it's basically going from alternative proteins to biopesticides, food colorants, fibers and specialty carbohydrates, biosurfactants and cosmetic ingredients. So it's basically very, very wide. And it's a lot of cool stuff. Materials, I forgot materials, sorry. So everything related to bioplastics, but for example, also spider silk and these fancy new cool materials that are being developed. So I think the nice thing about running a pilot facility that it's basically a funnel of innovation. Because if it doesn't work, it typically already gets stuck at the lower level. So it's basically the good innovations get to pilot scale, and it's very fun to see what kind of new things are possible.
So the things that, let's say, arrive, on your table or your plate, in that sense, already have a higher chance, right, of succeeding. Just
Correct.
okay. So it's kind of, you filter it out. Can you, just out of interest, I mean, what does the intellectual property concept look like here? Since obviously, the patents for the technology, I'm assuming, normally belong to the startup, right, or maybe a university. Is there in the scaling of these operations, is there new intellectual property? And if yes, who does that belong to?
So very simply said, when we don't use any specific BBEPP developed technology in the project, because that can happen, we have also quite some in-house work on gas fermentation, for example, where we have our own processes. But if we don't use it, and that's the majority of the projects, basically, 99%, then basically the IP belongs to the customer. So the foreground IP, the project results that you develop during the project belong to the customer. So and it's also logical, I think, because most of the IP goes into the bug, into the microbial strain that we do not develop. That's developed by the customer, brought to us. We use it as such. In the downstream, it's sometimes possible to really take patents on novel processes, but that also means that you will, yeah, of course, you have to bear the costs for the patent, but also that it will become public on how you've done it. So what we see is that mostly in downstream processing, techniques are more know-how, and people try to keep it in that know-how atmosphere. So what we do is that, of course, we've built a lot of general, what I would call industry know-how that we apply to the projects. It can happen that in some specific processes and some specific projects, you really develop new downstream processes that sometimes customers want to take a patent on. And then you need to have discussions, basically. Then you have to discuss with the customer, what will we do with this specific foreground IP? Because we know it's going to be developed. There's a high chance of that, and how are we going to deal with that? I think our take on it is that we're perfectly fine with the idea that the company has the IP, but it shouldn't block us to do our thing in the future. Because then, of course, if we have a number of those projects, we basically put a halt a bit on our operations because we will not be able to do what we want to do.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess that falls into also your USP, right? Of being able to then, further develop certain processes. Could you give us an example, maybe with one specific company that you can share? Sort of, what is the product they had? When did they come to you? And then what did you do to actually support in the scaling?
Yeah, there are a number of examples I could give. So you have to know that we've in the past 15 years done more than 900 projects for more than 270 companies, and I think if you would ask us what makes you proud is when a product gets to market, right? And what makes us even more proud is when a facility is being built, because then it's very tangible, right? What you've done. So please allow me to give an example of a project where it actually also resulted in the construction of a facility. It's a collaboration with Enough. I don't know if you know the company Enough. It's a food ingredient company, originally Scottish based from Glasgow. They produce mycoprotein. Product is called Abunda. What's specific for them is that they use side streams from the bioethanol industry. In their first plant, they use the side streams of the bioethanol facility of Cargill in Sas van Gent. Sas van Gent sounds like Ghent, but it's not Ghent. It's actually a small town across the border, so it's in the Netherlands. And what we've done with them, basically, they came to us back in 2018 that they wanted to scale up their process. Very early on, they involved us, and which I think was a good thing. Back then, it was still really a batch process run at 7-liter scale with the issues that it had. They had their own pilot facility, small pilot in Glasgow, 200 liters. So simultaneously, we're kind of optimizing the process together with them. So first doing tech transfer, then going to 1500-liter scale, resolving a lot of issues with mycotoxins, with oxygen depletion in the fermentation, a lot of technical things we sorted out. We then converted the process together with them into a continuous fermentation process that ran at 15,000 liter scale. And that really gave them the data and the blueprint to build their own facility, which they then built, only started building only 3 years later in 2021, also with the support of a CBE grant. In the previous edition, you had a talk with Marco Rupp from BIC. So CBE also supported with 17 million euro, if I recall well, the construction of that facility. And
17,
it
one
became
seven.
17 in grants, but the total infrastructure cost is much higher. I don't know if numbers are public on that, but it's probably close to 100 million if you take everything into account. So yeah, it all went very fast in this specific case. I think one very important reason for that is also that the product itself was already approved on the market. So it's basically just building a facility and producing the product. Where in most other products, and I assume we'll get back to this also later in the podcast, I mean, that's not that simple. I mean, there's a very long time to market because you need regulatory approval for your products.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also one of the main listed reasons as to why startups are struggling, with the commercialization and sort of keeping a viable business case because the regulation just takes, forever. I mean, something like the novel food, regulation. You're looking at 3 years, 4 years, something like this.
Yeah, and you also have to add those timelines up, because when you go to pilot scale, so basically you start with your develop process, right? But it needs some tweaking. It needs first validation, then you will figure out that potentially it needs some tweaking. You optimize it, and it's only when it's fixed that you can start your regulatory campaign. So then you have to do your regulatory batches in fermentation processes. Typically, you do 5 runs at, for example, 1500-liter scale. So that will also take time. So basically, when you add up the development time also with the regulatory approval time, you easily get between 5 to 10 years, depending on the product that you're developing. That means you need very patient capital, because you need investors who are willing to invest into the company for such a long time. And that makes it hard, yeah. And especially in Europe, where regulatory approval times are much longer than in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and that's 5 to 10 years before you're even commercially viable, right? So before market entry in that sense. So
Before product entry indeed, market entry. So it doesn't mean that you make a lot of profit then. It's just
Just even getting
market
there.
entry,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, first
absolutely.
series production.
Okay. And I mean, you've clearly since foundation, so since 2008, there's been a lot of development in the sector, especially in the startup scene, also because there is more funding available for these types of technologies. Can you share a little bit about your observations? Which bio-based applications have been growing, let's say, the most in the last 10 years?
It's nice and indeed to see these evolutions, I would say. I think there's always been a stable line of interest in materials and chemicals. So like bio-based plastics and bio-based chemicals, there has like always been kind of stable interest into it. What happened, of course, in 2019 is this huge interest into alternative proteins, right? Both biomass fermentation, where the microbe is the product itself. So, for example, mycoprotein, or precision fermentation, where basically the microorganism is used as a catalyst to produce a compound of interest, dairy protein, egg protein, and so on. So there's been a huge interest in that, and we have many projects still today, of course, running in that team. It was actually also one of the reasons why we set up the initiative called the Protein Club, where we, together with Ghent University, Capture and Ilvo, set up an organization specifically to promote the development and the innovation of microbial proteins, with, of course, also the idea that it will lead to more scale-up action, that it will lead to more demonstration, and also first of its kind production facilities in Europe and more specifically in our region. A second sector that I see a lot of interest in and really growing is biopesticides. Biopesticides, by the way, also have a very long approval process, so that's also not really helpful.
The
But I think,
biocide product regulation, right, of the European
yeah,
Union is,
yeah.
yeah. Mhm.
And the problem with bio-based pesticides, or no, sorry, the opportunity with bio-based pesticides is that they work very specifically. We see a lot of applications that we work on where they work very specifically towards one pest while leaving other wildlife untouched, not polluting groundwaters and other water bodies. Where with chemical pesticides, I mean, that's absolutely not the case. So you see a huge interest also from the sector to basically push this forward. So that's a sector that is growing. And I think recently is also the colorants sector. Colorants in type of food colorants, for example, because people are not always aware of that, but many of the foods we eat today, they are colored massively with synthetic dyes. So very, very nasty stuff. But also, for example, dyes in textiles. There's quite some news articles also about environmentally very hazardous conditions that people work at and using these very toxic dyes in textile factories. So there's also a lot of innovation ongoing these days on these topics. In the topic of food colorant, of course, what's helpful now is the decision that was made, or the announcement, because these days, what's the difference between a decision and an announcement in the US? Of Robert Kennedy Jr., where he announced that he would like to phase out synthetic dyes, which again gave a push into the market to go to natural colorants, and yeah, we also see that reflected in the work we do.
And how about the, yeah, let's say the bio-based energy sector or bio-based fuels? Is that something you're also working with?
We work on it, but in a more limited extent, I would say. It's also something that we also on purpose did not want to push too much on, because yeah, the whole discussion about biofuels is very loaded anyways. So everything related to first generation biofuels is very loaded. Second generation is very challenging, as we've seen, and because of course it's also quite obvious. I mean, in first generation, you basically just extract sugar from a sugar-rich or starch-rich feedstock. Where if you use second generation, you have to put much more energy into converting cellulose into sugars that are ready for fermentation. So it makes it very difficult to build the business case on it. We do quite some work on second generation conversions, but we work more on projects where we convert it into chemicals and materials rather than in fuels.
Okay, so you mentioned this, let's say, development, right, of the sector. You've seen new areas flourishing a bit more. How Is that mirrored, let's say, with the access to scale-up infrastructure? Can you give us an overview of the availability, I guess, of bio-based scaling infrastructures? So something like the BBEPP. But then in Europe, what types of plants are there and who has access to this?
So we're not the only ones, basically. Uh, I think if you take into account turnover and employees, then probably we're the biggest in Europe and worldwide. There are quite some other folks as well, and good organizations. I think it's important to distinguish it a bit between pilot and demo, because there are more pilot plants that have, let's say, fermenter sizes up to 1,500 liter scale or 3,000 liter scale, which is also a bit easier to operate. You can do it with a smaller staff. In demo sites, there are less. What we've seen, of course, is that in recent years, a lot of additional capacity has been built. Let's say the first wave was basically when we started off, then there were 5, 6 pilot facilities that started their operations. So that was us. CPI already existed for some time, ARD, BPF in the Netherlands, that since then also unfortunately went bankrupt. Fraunhofer Institute, which had a pilot facility, and VTT. And we kind of combined 6 of us in a let's say in a consortium to share also some insights. What we've seen is that most of those have expanded. We have expanded since then. ARD has expanded, others as well. Also, a lot of new initiatives have come up. Some of them are already online, others are coming online in the coming years. So you see really a huge increase in availability and infrastructure. What we did, and it was actually already in 2018, so it's quite some years ago, what we've noticed is that many people are not fully aware of what is already existing. So that means potential users, that also means politicians who want to support pilot and demo facilities in their own backyard. But basically, we set up the database of pilots for you, network and database of pilots for you. So people, if want to access it online, it's a very easy Google search and you'll find it. Where basically we map the existing infrastructure in the bioeconomy. So it's not only industrial biotech. So we work along different technology focuses. So basically, for every technology focus, you can find the pilot infrastructure that you need. So it also involves, for example, thermochemical conversion processes like gasification and so on. So there you can see a very nice overview. You can just filter very easily on what you need, and you will see the infrastructure that is available. Now, what's interesting is because there has been built a lot of additional infrastructure for piloting, but we also did a survey with the existing pilot infrastructure. So basically, the team contacted all the folks, asked them, okay, have you invested recently? Do you want to expand, etc.? And the response that they had is that a lot of them really expanded. But if you look at the availability, it means that most of them have a lot of availability that is unused. So basically, everybody was kind of hoping, and especially with the big boom in 2021, when old protein was a huge hype, everybody thought like, and every conference where you went to, by the way, said like, oh, there's going to be a capacity gap, both for production as for piloting. We don't have sufficient. There's going to be a huge problem. So based on that, a lot of people also expanded, including us. And now, a couple of years later, situation has changed. The demand has decreased substantially, and the infrastructure has increased. So as a result, there's quite some availability.
Okay, and when you say the capacity in Europe has increased, what are we talking about here? Like, do you have a number, an indication, like how many liters?
I don't have it in liters, to be honest. It's a good question, and it's something maybe we should also map. But what I mean is, like, when you had a couple of years ago, maybe a few sites that had 15,000 liter fermentation capacity for pilot and demo. Nowadays, you have 4 or 5 additional initiatives. There's an initiative in Finland, for example, that's going to build 27,000 liter fermenters also for demonstration, that's going to come online in the coming years. So I think we're talking about a capacity increase in total of, I think, a factor 3 to 5.
Okay, and so indeed, you don't have a lack of capacity, and in that sense, it's probably the question if there needs to be expansion, right? Especially with demand falling. And how can I imagine this? So, I mean, you mentioned, you are in Belgium. You mentioned a facility in the Netherlands. You mentioned Fraunhofer in Germany. How is this sort of, I mean, in Europe, right? We have so many different nationalities or countries, in this cluster, in this union. Is there a focus, let's say, from a national point of view, which companies are coming to you? Is this something that stays in the country? So German startups stay in Germany, Belgian startups, come to you? Or do you see a sort of international distribution?
Well, in our case, it's very international. And it's also one of the reasons why our name, it's a very long name, but it's biobased Europe pilot plant, because Belgium is a very small country. Our region, Flanders, is even smaller. So if you would only focus on companies coming from this region, I mean, it would not be sustainable. You wouldn't be able to run a pilot facility just based on customers from our region. So the majority of our customers come from Europe, and of course, proximity plays a role. I mean, for startups, I mean, when it's close, it will always be easier to run pilot runs. Of course, there are also some local grant opportunities, both in Flanders as in the Netherlands, where, of course, it's kind of required that the scale up is done in that region. I'm not saying I'm agreeing with that. We can discuss about it in a later part of the podcast. It means basically, if you look at our customers, they come from everywhere. So also including United States and also including Asia. We recently also had our first Latin American projects. So we kind of span all continents now.
Wow. Congrats. That's very cool. I'm guessing, though, also with regards to, sourcing waste streams, which normally are quite local to local business models, I'm assuming this must be sort of in a cluster, right? Around where you're located.
Yes, but for pilot and demo, it's not really that an issue.
Okay.
For example, with the project I was referring to with the Latin American customer, we're working on bagasse. It's not our bagasse. In Europe, you only have bagasse, I think, on the Canary Islands, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe also on Madeira. So we don't have locally sourced bagasse. That doesn't exist. Bagasse from sugarcane for the listeners. So it's for the pilot runs. It's basically just shipped from Latin America to us. So that's not an issue. I mean, you're doing piloting, you're doing demonstration. I think what you want to achieve is you want to be successful, and then you're going to collaborate with the company that guarantees you that it will be success. Um, you only allow me to give one example, and earlier on, but maybe another one that is nice because you're talking about this is the collaboration with Celtic Renewables. Celtic Renewables, also a Scottish company, they convert side streams from the whiskey industry
That's
the
cool.
whiskey industry into acetone, butanol, and ethanol, which can be used as fuels or chemicals. So basically, what they use the draff, which is kind of spent grain in the whiskey making, or the pot ale, so the distillate after, also in the next step of the whiskey making, that is combined. Current practices that use that for animal feed, what they do, they convert it by fermentation in this ethanol, acetone, butanol, ethanol. So they worked with us. They were a small Scottish startup. They worked with us because we were the only ones who could run the process. There's some nice videos on that also on our YouTube channel. They checked different places and we were the only ones. And nowadays they've built a facility in Scotland. So I also want to show to policymakers that where the scale up is done is not that important. It's where the facility is built. If you want to promote bio-based activities in your region, I mean, promote building first of its kind production facilities. Help indeed in arranging the logistics, because logistics are an important thing in setting up a bio-based value chain. I don't think it's important where the scale up has been done. I mean, just do it where you think it will work out.
Fair enough. So in that sense, yeah, the scale up, it's the information, right? It's the learning of how to do it,
It's a
but
data
then it's
package.
the
Yeah.
data, true. And then you just apply that in whichever location.
Yeah.
I might get back to you on Celtic Renewables because maybe I want to have a conversation with them too.
Yeah.
So you have a quite or very international group of customers or companies that are coming to you. Would you say you're able to give some kind of overview on, which areas in the world have the largest investment activity in the sector? Where's the funding coming from? And yeah, what challenges are you also maybe facing with regards to the fundraising and scaling of production?
Yeah. I think we're very well located in Ghent and Belgium because we still also see most investments in Western Europe. So Western Europe, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, UK, although we had UK for some time when also they went out of Horizon Europe. I think it was a bit of a difficult time for innovation. Now they joined the program again, and you see also again more interest from companies to collaborate with us, basically. So that's good. The Nordic countries, of course, have always been very strong in industrial biotech or biosolutions. In Denmark, obviously, with the big giants, Novo Nordisk and Novo Nordisk have a huge interest in the sector and a lot of investments linked to that. So that's when I look at Europe, that's basically for our sector the most important geographies. Outside Europe, I mean, the ones that we work with is basically the Bay Area in the United States. Most of the investments come out of the Bay. We do map also other regions and we're in contact with other regions in the US, but it's I mean, in number of companies in investment sizes, it's no comparison to what you have in the Bay Area. You now see, of course, in other geographies, for example, Brazil, also again, more and more interest in the sector. In India, more investment. Also in Japan, where the Japanese government has launched a program, I think already a couple of years ago by now, supporting their own startups to develop new solutions for bio-based chemicals and bio-based energy. I think those are probably, and South Korea, those are probably the most important geographies, I think.
Yeah, about India, I actually spoke about this with Marco Rupp in the previous episode. It's also really a very growing sector. It's being, kind of termed strategically important to the actual like overall economic plan of the country. Earlier, you talked about how regulation is affecting innovation in this sector. What is your take on this? Is the regulatory framework in EU and I guess also in Belgium representing a challenge, or is it supporting innovation in this area?
Well, I think it's definitely a challenge. It hinders innovation, and I think most legislation comes from Europe. So the Belgian level is to a lesser extent important. Although also depending a bit on the product that you're targeting, it can have an influence because some legislation is more on a European level. Sometimes it's also a combination of Belgian legislation and European. Just it's very complex. So that's also one of the issues I want to touch upon. But of course, the most apparent problem for companies who want to scale up their technologies in Europe is basically the long approval times. No matter which product you want to bring on the market, whether it's REACH regulation, whether it's EFSA approval, it takes an awful lot of time. And when I look specifically at EFSA, so the approval times for novel foods typically take 2-3 times longer than what you have at FDA. Although that might change also a little bit in the future with the firings that, of course, happened at FDA, but also the intention to stop working with self-affirming grass. It's not decided yet, but there's an intention to do that. So that might change a bit the comparison, the benchmarking between Europe and the United States. But nonetheless, it takes an awful lot of time. And I think one of the main reasons, because the question is, of course, how can we solve that, is that at FDA, you can have free consultations. So basically, before you submit your dossier, you can have interactions with FDA, making sure that you have all the data included in your dossier so that you will not needlessly stretch the application time. But also during the process, you can have feedback sessions, basically, where in Europe at EFSA, there's really a thick concrete wall between the application and the regulatory bodies. And as a result, and I've heard many stories of companies that we've worked with, is that they submit a dossier, they get questions back from EFSA, which to their impression, knowledge, are not reasonable questions. So what do you do then? So either you stop you stop your application, or just going to gather all the data necessary to basically fulfill the needs of the regulatory body. In many cases, resulting in big costs because additional experiments need to be done that can easily cost up to 100,000 euro just to do something that is not worthless, you can say, basically. So that's something we definitely have to work on in Europe. And I think an additional thing, and it's also something I touched upon a little bit, is when we said the mix between Belgian level and European legislation. I think also it makes it super complex also between different products and technologies, the mix that you have, because you have the novel food regulation, but you also have the GMO legislation. So you always have to fulfill multiple legislations that all result in longer approval times, longer time to market, and less appetite from investors to invest in our sector because they know, okay, they know what they step into, but they don't know
It's quite
how long they will have to stay into the company.
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's quite a paradox in a way because we have a tightening regulatory framework in the European Union, towards more sustainable and circular practices. But then on the other hand, actually getting there is made almost impossible in the sense of having a viable business case, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm a positive person, and I'm a bit optimistic these days because first of all, the US shooting itself in the foot with the amateurism that is sometimes basically there to come up with new law or to fire people and so on. To well, can have a long discussion about that. But I see also in Europe a new wind, also with the new commission, where basically there's a lot of focus on competitiveness, a lot of focus of, okay, we understand the issues. We know, first of all, startups have difficulties to scale in Europe. So there was recently, end of May, the announcement of a scale-up fund that will be kind of also public-private collaboration that should be a fund of double-digit billion euro. So I have high hopes on this. So that's one thing. I think also on the permitting side, because it's not only the regulatory approval of your product, it's also when you want to build the facility, you need permits for that. That's also quite of a hassle in Europe. You also see a willingness to look at that. So I'm quite optimistic. But okay, it's a lot of words. I hope the Commission will now also put those words into action.
So overall, you have a optimistic view on the development of bio-based innovation in Europe.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And maybe as one of the last questions, what advice would you give startup founders that are active in the sector, that they should keep in mind when approaching this stage?
What I see, especially in Europe, a bit to a lesser extent in the United States, is that I would advise talk with a lot of people. And what I mean is talk a lot with a lot of consultants who have done this in the past, who know how to scale. Work with us, obviously. We will combine. I think the consultants are very good also for the strategy building because startups tend to underestimate what is necessary, what it takes to get a product to scale or to build the facility. So you really have to think, okay, what do I want to achieve? Will I produce my product at the CDMO in the end because it's a specialty product, so I don't need to build an own facility for that? Will I build my own production plant? So that's one thing you need to have in mind, and then you have to basically calculate back on what's necessary in scale up. Because I'll give you one example. What a lot of folks do is they start scale up. They use a massive amount of water in their processes, and they have no plan to kind of reuse that water. In the downstream, they have a lot of washing steps. Can that water be reused in fermentation? Never tested. It's something that typically they only start testing once they get to production scale. When they build their own facility, then it's sometimes a bit too late. Also, when you use membranes, for example, in the downstream, how long can those last? Can they use them 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, 20 times? All those things need to be tested. So you basically have to think about a lot of stuff that can go wrong at the large scale. And it's really building up that kind of risk mitigation plan, I would say is super important, and also translate that risk mitigation plan into what you want to test at pilot scale, and also at which point in time do you want to test it.
Hendrik, you've given us an amazing insight into what you're doing over there in Ghent. Could you summarize for us the impact that the BioBase Europe pilot plant has on the development of, innovation in the bioeconomy in Europe?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of our organizational values is very catchy, pioneering for a better world. And basically, you see that reflected in every project that we do. And that's also, I think, what makes it fun to work in this kind of organization. Because in every project that we do, you see that you target a certain sustainability topic. So it can be less land use, less water use, not polluting water, less CO2, of course, more healthy products, etc., etc. So that's very nice. But to put it more into numbers, so I told already that we've done more than 900 projects for more than 270 companies worldwide. Probably a dozens of those projects resulted in a product that is produced at CDMO level. You have to know that not always the companies inform us. We do the scale up for them, but then it's not that well. We get all the feedback on what happened with that product. Sometimes when we meet them, of course, we talk about it, and this way we know. But I know of many of those going to CDMO level and being routinely manufactured these days. And then in addition to that, of course, you have the plants that were built. So in Europe alone, the ones that we mapped, it corresponds to a total investment of more than 500 million euro into biomanufacturing. So 500 million euro biomanufacturing of innovations that have been scaled up at the BioBased Europe pilot plant. Yeah.
That's amazing. And I think the more the sector will develop, the more important business models like the one at BBEPP will become.
Yeah, and also maybe one thing I wanted to add, I say 500 million, but you also know between scaling up a process and then actually also getting the return on investment, so to speak, in building a facility, producing your product. I mean, that takes time. In the case of Innov, it went very quickly because of the reasons I already explained. In other cases, it goes a bit at a slower pace. But what we see is that 500 million has basically been realized with the smaller infrastructure that we had back in the days from 2010 to 2018, maybe. So now we've tripled in capacity. So I hope that also the impact that we will generate will be more visible, let's say in 10 years' time.
Hendrik, this has been a super valuable insight on the podcast, because every company that is joining or has joined so far has mentioned, that the scaling of operations is one of their main challenges. So very excited to see how the plant will continue to grow and which other innovations you'll be able to bring to market. Thank you for keeping us in the biocircular loop today.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for listening in today. Don't be shy and make sure to follow the podcast for more episodes coming every 2 weeks on Mondays to start your week off just right with new ideas and hopefully some inspiration. If you have any questions or comments about this episode, send me a message on LinkedIn or via email. You can find the details in the show notes. And that's all from me. I'm your host, Melina Gerdts. Have a good week and stay tuned for the next episode to stay in the biocircular loop.